Hello there. Today's guest is Yaakov Aharon. Yaakov is a journalist who has a unique skill set. He was raised in a incredibly orthodox Jewish family and spent much of his early life involved in Zionist bureaucracies that are in the news today in Australia. Yaakov joins the program to provide a unique insight into the nature of Zionist influence in Australia. He delineates the hierarchy of supranational and national Zionist entities and explores how they connect and coordinate. He also looks into the comprehensive nature of this control and how it may be diminishing due to the fact of the undeniable genocide in Gaza. So, with no further ado, please join us for a riveting conversation with Yaakov Aharon. Welcome to the program, Yaakov Aharon. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We know each other pretty well. Firstly, I just thought maybe you could introduce yourself and share a little bit about your work and what you focus on, particularly around the influence of Zionist lobby groups in Australia.
Sure. Well, I guess quick intro to who I am and what I do. About 9 months ago, I accidentally became a journalist. And I mean, I've been writing all my life and discussing geopolitics and what's happening with Israel and Palestine and really around my Sabbath dinner table since I was a kid. I grew up as an ultra-Orthodox Jew, extremely messianic. You could even say perhaps cult-like group. Um, and 8 hours of Bible a day, very messianic. And so, it's given me a bit of a golden ticket, you could say, to giving a fresh perspective on what's happening with Israel and Palestine, that isn't very common. I've been on a pretty long, arduous political journey from one end of the spectrum politically to the other side. And it's given me a lot of stories and dirt to dish out.
So take me through that journey from one side to the other a little bit. What was that about for you, and what did it entail? I suppose.
Mm. Well, growing up, we didn't really speak to non-Jews or to even girls, really. Um, it was a very sheltered community. We grew up in Bondi, but we did not go to the beach. Life was just lapsed between school and synagogue and home. But when I was 10 years old, we started to do, a bit of evangelism on the streets of Bondi, coming up to people, asking if they're Jewish or not, asking if they want to put on the tefillin leather straps, if they are Jewish, or if they're not Jewish, if they want to follow like the 7 laws of Noah. Um, and then around 2005, we were always under the supervision of adults, but that was our exposure to the outside world. It wasn't, really engaging with the non-Jewish world. It was evangelizing, it was, cult-like behavior. Um, so when around 2005, I'd have been 10 years old, and Israel was disengaging, pulling the settlers out from the Gaza Strip. We were handing out, these far right pamphlets saying Jews do not expel Jews. That was on the side of the settlements. I mean, that was where I started. It was aligned with a sanctioned terrorist under Israeli and American law, a guy called Mayor Kahana, and Kahana's ideology, very, very far right stuff. Um, and, I've always been the sort, Joel will tell you, it's been a lot of times where I've said, mate, that's a good point. I think I was wrong. I've always been that guy. So, I've always been the sort to say, hey, mate, you made a good point. And when the evidence changes, I change my mind. I lost a lot of debates, and was always willing to chat to the other side. And frankly, the other side was correct. So I went on an Israel junket at 16 with a Zionist group. They took me to IDF recruitment centers. And then when I was 20, I was being mentored by a professor of philosophy, which was pretty staunchly anti-Zionist. And he beat me a lot in the debates. He took me to Palestine with the Australian Palestinian Advocacy Network on another study tour. And it just gave me, the perspective on the other side of the wall, almost literally. So I left on that trip as a Zionist. pretty much had an anxiety attack on the plane because I was surrounded by Arabs speaking the scary language of Arabic. Um, for a kid of the 9/11 generation, that was really scary. I, I began that trip as a Zionist and I left as an anti-Zionist. And ever since then, around the age of 21, my views have mostly been within that camp.
Yeah, it's quite incredible how the contrast between your first visit, under the umbrella of Israel and the junket that you were going on there, and then contrasted with that tour that you went later on. Uh, is this something that is concealed? The latter tour there that you had, is that concealed from wider Jews around the world and even in Israel? The
Well,
realities that you saw there. Yeah.
from my the bottom line is that if they want to know, they can know. Everything's on the internet. Um, and but that is kind of an excuse. There is kind of an excuse for them not knowing, but also, I mean, just the pull of society and culture, where you're from, where you're born is so strong. And I sometimes say to people, like, I don't know if I wouldn't have been a Nazi if I was born in Nazi Germany in 1935. I mean, I can't imagine. And I can't imagine if I would be an anti-Zionist if I was born in Israel. It's a very different experience. But I mean, I remember one thing that was just such a stark contrast. I mean, I was working in the Israel lobby at 18 and 19 with a group called Jewish Board of Deputies in New South Wales. And I was drafting media statements, and I was the president of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students on UNSW campus. I was the guy who knew things about conflict, but I didn't know what the Nakba was until I was 20. Never met a Palestinian. I didn't know that they ate falafel and hummus. I didn't know these foods existed before 1948. So I really had no knowledge of the other side, but I was someone who was very well informed enough to actually work with the Israel lobby, and run the pro-Israel group on campus. I only knew of the one side. When I went on these trips to Israel and Palestine, first one at 16, I remember, you drive down the highways, there's all these ruins everywhere on the side of the highways. And they would say to me, look how rich Israel's history is. There's Roman ruins just everywhere, and they're kind of just part of the landscape. It's nothing special. And then when I went on the Palestine trip, they said, well, all of these are ruins from the Nakba. They're everywhere. It's in plain sight, the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba. And obviously, the latter is true, but you don't even think about it. I mean, it's bizarre to even think that there's Roman ruins on ground level, virtually in perfect mint condition everywhere, all over the side of the highways. Um, it's a bizarre thing to brainwash kids into thinking, but that's the way it is. There's very little perspective of the other side.
It's incredible how you contrast the situation in Israel, where people walk past the crimes of only decades ago. How do people have that in their periphery every day, but continue to drive along these freeways and have conversations like it never happened? Like, is it something like that where it's pushed to the side? And yourself, when you were out there evangelizing, were you sort of seeing this one track and putting the blinkers on deliberately, or was it something where it was enforced to you through nature and nurture? You had to carry a kind of particular posture. You know what I'm trying to say.
I think it's just incredibly difficult. I mean, people talk in doublespeak when it comes to politics all the time. And often we take that as thinking, oh, they're acting in bad faith, especially because they're from the other side and we don't like the other side. So they must be acting in bad faith. But people really believe in all this doublespeak. I mean, I was having a conversation with the Zionist just the other day. Um, and he was of the view that all of these images of starving Palestinian kids are fake, doesn't believe a single one of them. And I said to him, well, but you also believe Hamas is stealing the aid, right? And he goes, yeah. I said, well, so which one is it? Like, is the food getting through to the civilians, to the kids? And he goes, yeah. So, but if Hamas is stealing all the aid, then how can it? And he had a big long think and said, let's change the subject. It's,
When it's happening so close, though, within kilometers, meters, this sort of this contrast, this like death ground where there's been 80% of the buildings destroyed, and McDonald's meals happening down the road. Do everyday Israelis like lack curiosity? Like, does society condemn being curious in that space? How, as a young person, are you denied of the curiosity to kind of look around and see what's around you, right? Like, it must be very hard to shake that curiosity out of young people in Israel who, just by being inquisitive youths, can see what's happening, or want to find out what's happening in their country or around them. How is this missing? Because like it's a sustained kind of situation over the Palestinian people, uh, and it just seems like so hard to prop up. So what sort of drives that? What's the difference, if you don't mind me asking?
I mean, so much of it is just, yeah, there's a lack of curiosity, there's a lack of sympathy. There is literally a massive amount of Israelis think of the Palestinians as subhuman. I mean, literally subhuman. And it's just like, killing a cockroach you see in your kitchen. Um, and some of them, maybe they're a bit more sympathetic, but they don't want to know. And then at the same time, the moment you brand someone as a terrorist, it's forbidden to defend them, culturally in any sort of way. You're not, and if you defend them, then you're supporting terrorism, and you are as bad as the terrorist. So this, the moment they get that label slapped on them, they're persona non grata. Um, but I mean, fundamentally, I think people don't understand how small this space of land is. That Tel Aviv is an hour drive away from Gaza, and that there are towns literally right by the Gaza border on the Israeli side. There's nowhere in Israel just about that isn't an hour or 2 hours tops drive from somewhere that is illegally occupied land. So, these towns right by Gaza, they can see the clouds of smoke. They'd be able to smell the death. They'd be able to hear the booms and the bangs. There's even a place in the town called Sderot that they call Sderot Cinema because it's a massive hilltop overlooking Gaza. And for about 15 years, it's been a gathering point where you'll get Israelis camping overnight, setting up couches and tents when there's a big offensive onslaught being launched against Gaza, and they will, enjoy the show. And they'll take tourists there. I mean, when I was growing up, we were told about the Holocaust, and we were saying, the Nazis had no excuse because there were residential towns right next to um, the 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 death camps, and that they could smell the disease, they could smell the the burning bodies from the crematoriums, they could smell um, the stench of death from the death camps from places like Auschwitz. When there was a storm, it would rain ash from the bodies, it would rain ash on the residential towns nearby. And so we would say, how could they have not known? There's no excuse. Um, the human mind is a powerful thing, and people speak and double speak, and they believe in double speak. And sometimes also they're just evil people. Sometimes they just see it as, you're killing cockroaches in your kitchen with a can of Mortine. Um,
You try and be sympathetic to what would be happening within Israel, to the people within it, how they'd be feeling, cornered, pressured. That there's an existential crisis around the corner. How much of that is real, and how much of that is perceived or imagined is another story completely. Uh, w- we I'd love to have you back on to speak about some of these issues another time, and to speak about Israeli society as a whole, and how it might interact organically in this time. But we have got you on today to speak about Zionist influence in Australia, and potentially, how it works in Israel. To begin with, the 2025 Mayors Summit Against Antisemitism in the Goldie, which is sort of been hosted by a couple of US based groups. You're writing about this with Wendy Bacon at the moment, and I know you can only sort of briefly touch on it. But can you sort of shed a little bit of light on the event? And it's been hosted by Maverick Mayor Tom Tate, and it's got CAM involved, which is Combat Antisemitism Movement, which is linked to David Gonski on the board. So I was just
Mm.
wondering if you could let us know what the primary objectives of this summit are to begin with.
Yeah, you'll have to stay tuned for the article published, actually two articles published soon in Michael West Media, co-written by Wendy Bacon and I. So until it's published, I can only go a bit into kind of surface level. Um, but this summit, I mean, every councillor just about across Australia has been given an invite, all expenses paid, stay in the Gold Coast. It sounds like a nice holiday if it wasn't, something as dark and horrific as this. I mean, the bottom line is, I mean, who doesn't oppose racism and who doesn't want equality and who doesn't oppose anti-Semitism? I mean, but anti-Semitism really has become, I would say, we're past the point where it's conflated, where the waters are muddied. Like we are neck deep in mud at this point. Um, and the objective of the Israel lobby, the way that they do things is that they will never ever actually play the ball. It's always about playing the player. Go for the character assassination. Say, well, you said maybe you have a point, but you said it in the wrong way, and it's insensitive and it's anti-Semitic, and it's always the point is to distract. Um, and so, last year, 2 years ago, the Australian Jewish Association, for example, was running all sorts of campaigns and webinars. There was a Better Council launched for the New South Wales local government elections, which was running on the slogans of, councils should return to roads, rates, and rubbish. That councils, they said, should not act as if they're the United Nations. Like, take care of your local constituents. And so they would only actually step up these groups, which Wendy Bacon and I have also written about, Better Council, but they'd only ever actually take any action, these groups, if you were voting on something like a ceasefire in Gaza at your local council, or if you were voting on a boycott motion of Israeli products. There was never any action if you were flying the Israeli flag outside of your council, like what was happening in Wallara Council. Um, I mean, Waverley Council also passed pretty significant pro-Israel motions back in the beginning of the genocide. And, Better Council and Australian Jewish Association completely quiet on that front. I mean, that's in their backyard. They were especially active in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. But no, they're active when Randwick Council um, um, puts forward a motion supporting a ceasefire. That's when they'll step up. When the Inner West Council has a motion on boycotting Israel and cutting any local government contracts with Israel, that's when they'll say, let's not get involved with international politics. So now we're moving on in our current stage. Every councillor gets a sweet, nice, all expenses paid flights, accommodation, junket to the Gold Coast, beautiful hotel in a holiday spot right by the beach, to attend a massive conference. Keynote speakers, Gillian Siegel, our special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, um, Israel lobby extraordinaire. And suddenly they want to play the United Nations. Suddenly they want to get involved in geopolitics, but they'll only actually take that stance openly, publicly, when it's about supporting Israel. To them, anti-Semitism is saying that Israel is possessed by bloodlust against the Palestinians, or that it's saying that Israel's committing a genocide. That says the anti-Semitic trope of blood libel, or saying free Palestine from the river to the sea is calling for Israel's destruction, and as the Jewish state, you're denying the Jewish people the right to national self-determination. This is their understanding of anti-Semitism. So, I mean, make no mistake, you can support an equal society where anti-Semitism is no longer a problem, but that is not what this conference is about.
So this is a junket, as you say, and it is a pretty cushy trip to the Gold Coast. I spoke to a Victorian councillor recently, who somehow received an invite after she was an advocate for Gaza and the Palestinian people in her own electorate, and it caused a lot of controversy. So she's still dealing with now with the executive there, but the whole nature of something like this is so like out in the open at the moment, and we're going in the light of Gillian Siegel, the person you're mentioning as a keynote speaker, who's kind of lost a lot of credibility recently, delivering some quite controversial appearances in the media, delivering her report. And it seems like this with CAM, for example, which I don't really know much about. And they're hosting this summit, and this is sort of another example of this sort of transnational pipeline of these Zionist groups that are linking up at the state of Israel level, at an international level, and then as you've researched and written about, into Australia at a state, federal, and local level. So, can you give us a little bit of an understanding about how this transnational advocacy works, starting off at like an international level, and how it might like trickle down a little bit to Australia?
Yeah, sure. Well, again, you will have to stay tuned for the real juicy details when the article is published. But Wendy and I, when we were looking into this, we found pretty significant connections between Combat Antisemitism Movement, which is an American organization with an Australian chapter, you could say, Australian organizers, Australian board members. Um, and we found significant connections between CAM and what's called Israel's national institutions. So that is with a capital N and I. The national institutions are, I mean, described as non-governmental organizations, NGOs, but in almost every single way you can think of. Again, that's doublespeak to describe them as an NGO. They predate the founding of Israel, and they were kind of like Israel's government in waiting. I mean, beginning in, I believe it was 1935 until 1948, the president of the Jewish Agency for Israel was David Ben-Gurion, who straight away became Israel's first prime minister. Now, there's four national institutions in Israel. There's the World Zionist Organization, which is kind of like the legislature, right? Um, the legislature of the kind of government side of these organizations. And then there's the Jewish Agency for Israel. You could think of it as kind of the executive arm. So they take what's legislated and voted on by the World Zionist Organization, which has almost like a parliamentary structure, and some sort of quasi-democratic process. And then there's the Jewish Agency, which executes and exacts and implements what the World Zionist Organization (WZO) has voted on. And then you get the United Israel Appeal, which is almost like the Treasury, massive fundraising wing. In Australia, it's a registered charity with roughly $50 million to their name. Um, And then there's the Jewish National Fund, which is kind of like the the landlords. Um, and there is also an Australian Jewish National Fund chapter. And so these guys um, micromanage all the different Jewish communities around the world. I mean, for example, the Zionist Federation of Australia and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry partnered with the World Zionist Organization. And when I said before that they have a parliamentary type structure, what I mean is that when they meet to have votes on different motions and things like that, I believe it's annually. Be wrong.
So there's a
When they meet,
Congress. There's an international
yeah,
Congress. Yep.
yeah. And there's also the World Jewish Congress, which is similar but technically not a national institution. And groups like the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and the Zionist Federation of Australia, which are what's called peak roof bodies of the Australian Jewish community, um, they will have representation. They'll send a delegation of their leaders um, to the World Zionist Organization to vote on certain things, and there'll be factions and caucuses and almost like parties and different groups banding together and saying, "Well, I'll vote for your guy to be running the show at World Zionist Organization if you vote for this." I mean, just like any parliament. Um,
Who's putting up the
and they,
Who's putting up the policy, Yakov, at these at these events?
I mean, the bottom line is it's centered in Israel. Everything is centralized in Israel. All of these groups. So no organization is more um, no country has better representation than Israel itself. And of course, these things are national institutions with special legal status in Israel. So they are tied at the hip to Israel's agenda. I mean, I can give you a quote here. This comes from the World Zionist Organization's website. It says, uh, since the establishment of the State of Israel, the national institutions have continued to work cooperatively to advance the Zionist enterprise, complementing and interacting with one another in areas as diverse as immigration, land reclamation, settlement, strengthening Jewish life in diaspora communities, Zionist education, rescue of endangered Jewish populations, partnering with Jewish communities around the world, combating anti-Semitism, fundraising, pro-Israel advocacy, and fashioning Israel as an exemplary society as an expression of the Zionist ideal, end quote. So it's pretty explicit that these guys are running the show from Israel and micromanaging all the Jewish communities around the world. Um, and, you know, the Jewish community organizations that describe themselves as peak roof bodies here in Australia or really any country, pick up to these guys, answer to these guys, take their memos, their notes, their dossiers, their talking points for the media from these guys.
And
They're required
these
to fall in
guys,
line.
sorry, these guys that you mentioned, are they the decision makers entirely? So at these congresses, when their ZFA goes, for example, the Zionist Federation of Australia, do they have some kind of sway over, as you say, this quasi-democratic process to influence decisions, or is this really a chance for Israel to come and kind of hammer in the policy that needs to be, dictating the policy essentially to these Zionist bodies, these national Zionist bodies around the world?
Um, I would say, I mean, to some degree, the talking points and memos and briefings and um, all that is also dictated by, um, the Israeli embassy in that country, by the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs and by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. And also, I mean, in another way, there's only so much that these Israeli organizations can hold your hand when you're living in Australia and you're dealing with the Australian political and media landscape. Um, they will have to wing it when they're here on some issues. but it's very rare for people to step out of line. I mean, there was one really significant thing where Mark Liebler, he's like the Israel lobby boss here in Australia, or one of the bosses. Um, his brother Izzy Liebler really stepped out of line when he resigned and left on kind of difficult terms from the Australian lobby, moved to Israel, tried to continue, in the within the lion's den with those jobs. And Izzy Liebler, that was the brother's name, he kicked up a storm because he was raising the question of where is all of our funding going? Where there's millions of dollars disappearing. It became a massive scandal. But that sort of thing happens very rarely, and it's very, very taboo. I mean, every Jewish person and every Zionist, every Israeli loves to use the word, the phrase, to not air dirty laundry. Don't air that dirty laundry in public. There's things that are for us to know and for us to talk about behind closed doors and maybe in the privacy of our home. And even then, maybe it's not right to air your dirty laundry in front of your siblings or your business partners. I mean, it can be taken to the nth degree. So they're constantly shunning anyone who speaks out.
And none of these groups that are massed together at these annual conferences, none of these groups would be more progressive or anti-war or anything like that. Would they essentially be in lockstep with the policies of Israel and just essentially attending to receive receive the update, the memo, as you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look through the media statements of groups like Zionist Federation of Australia, Executive Council of Australian Jewry, New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, a great one, all these groups, it's really once a decade that they criticize Israeli government policy on anything to do with Palestine. And maybe once every 5 years, they'll they'll publish a statement that's a bit stronger and firmer, which criticizes Israeli policy insofar as it relates to other Jews or other citizens, but it's very rare you get them to, say a single word that's critical about anything involving national security. I remember when I was on my first day at the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, and my manager showed me where the bathroom was and where the stationery cupboard is and where my desk is and so on. And she sat me down and she said, first thing you got to know is that we have a policy. We do not criticize current Israeli government policies. Our job is to support, or worse, to stay silent and passively support. So what that means is that right now you have the government, which actually 30 years ago, the one of those rare occasions where our lobby organizations stepped up and said some bad words about Israel. They were saying when the Bibi Netanyahu was first running in elections, they were calling him a fascist, and they were correct. And they were saying Israel's going down a dark path. But then he won election, and they have a policy. You support the Israeli government of the day. So when you have the Israeli Labour Party in power, or you have a lobby group that is in lockstep with the Israeli Labour Party, or when you have 30 years or so of a fascist prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu, and every single election he gets even more fascist than the year before, then you have a lobby group that is in lockstep with Israel as it goes down this fascist hellhole.
Yeah, all these kind of like the connective tissue of Netanyahu's kind of spree is, are these groups. And as you say, everyone's going down this kind of dark path. It's such a complex and kind of multifaceted organization here, across
Mm.
many levels, like a supranational scenario. Um, how for like how are they coordinating the efforts between the international and the state based and the local? How are they essentially coordinated? And how are they working to, essentially change the narrative and counter anti-Israel sentiment in society? What's going on behind the scenes, and what's the money being spent on, I suppose?
Well, it's very rare that you'll get public infighting, but it does happen behind closed doors. Even then, there really is a culture of don't air dirty laundry. And usually, whoever's further to the right wins that conversation. It's a matter of what you consider airing dirty laundry, because even sometimes the privacy of your own home, or um, you know, a work meeting within the Israel lobby, it's still like, well, why are you saying this in front of the manager? Um, so that argument, for some reason, only ever seems to go one way, and that's to shut down anyone who's a bit more progressive within the lobby itself. Um, so the memos and everything, they're very, very good at putting up a unified front. And one of the reasons for that, take for example the two-state solution as an example, and the discourse around it. These key proof bodies in Australia have staked their whole reputation and political and public image on being this reasonable center. And the two-state solution is the perfect facade for the reasonable liberal center. You know, sure, you say that all of this land is yours, but what if we just take half of your land instead? And we're going to keep on taking more land until you agree, and you'll just every moment that passes you're agreeing to less and less of half, you know. Um and um now it's at the point where, Bibi Netanyahu, he actually used to pay lip service to two-state solution. It was never really something he intended to go through. I mean, his party's political charter says that it will never happen. um Uses the words, there'll never be a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, funnily enough. Um, but he used to pay lip service, especially when he's speaking in English. He was a lot more radical when he speaks in Hebrew. And so these Israel lobby groups here in Australia, they would pay lip service too, and they're putting up more of a public image of being more liberal and centrist. So, there's a peace process, and we're just trying to find the right time to move towards a two-state solution. In what is it now, 77 years of Israeli history, they still haven't found the right opportunity to recognize a Palestinian state. They're just waiting. It's never been the right time, but one day it will come. And now it's just not feasible. I mean, there's something like 700,000 settlers living in the West Bank illegally. It's split up into all these tiny little Bantustans that are completely disconnected from each other. And you're never going to be able to have a two states. Just, it's not feasible. And I mean, even if there was in Gaza, there's nothing to return to at this point. It's been flattened. So these people in the peak roof bodies, they can't backtrack on a two-state solution. It would be political suicide, because their whole public image since the birth of that organization is banking on it.
And
So
just how Netanyahu's endangered the Israeli state, the viability of it. It's also damaged the efficacy of these bodies, right? To be able to function.
yeah, but what they've always done is, instead of disagreeing outright with Bibi, instead of saying he is sabotaging the two-state solution, they just reinterpret. They just justify in hindsight, justify after the fact, and reinterpret his actions as, well, he's building the settlements because, um, well, you need an extra security wall over there. And the settlements have families, and families grow. So you're going to build more houses, right? But the Palestinians need to accept the two-state solution. Otherwise, it's just not the right time right now. But there's never actually this serious, honest reckoning with the fact that it is Israel's government that has killed this, that has murdered the two-state solution deliberately, and that it was never something that was seriously being pursued. Um, Instead, it's always just justifying the fact that, well, yeah, of course we're taking more land because there's not a solution yet, and the families in the settlements are growing, so of course we are. But it, there's that's the way that they manage those differences in airing dirty laundry. Now you're getting like the Australian Jewish Association, which is a lot more gung ho, brazen, noisy. You'd almost say Trump like populist far right, openly far right. And they're correct in saying that they represent what Israeli society actually believes. They say we're the only group in Australia, the major Jewish communal group that openly opposes the two-state solution. They want Israel to have all the land, and they're not afraid to say it. And they are correct in saying that's what the majority of Israelis believe. But they're a new organization that popped up, I believe it was 2017. So they haven't built their public image for decades on this facade, this lie of a two-state solution and the peace process. Um,
The
and
blinkers that I spoke about earlier, though, and how you deliver in this here, like there must be some kind of ignorance again being applied within these groups because it seems like they're sort of damaging their chance to survive. Right, the very viability of these groups is being shattered by virtue of their attachment to the status quo. And like I have seen recently the Zionist Federation of Australia has released a statement, kind of condemning the the arc of forced starvation that's being sort of imposed in Gaza at the moment, and that might show a little bit of a like a separation between these like centralized narratives in Tel Aviv. Like, could that be a bit of an example of that?
yeah, I mean, it's pretty significant this moment. I mean, right now we're recording this podcast at the tipping point in history on this narrative, in that um, the famine in Gaza is undeniable. And Albanese has said that Israel's committing um, breaches of international law by withholding aid. The same charges that the International Criminal Court has charged Bibi Netanyahu with. The famine is undeniable. You can't bullshit about it. It's like what I was saying before. I mean, until now, I've known Zionists who believe at the same time that there's no famine and all these photos of starving kids are fake. Um, and then at the same time, they believe that Hamas is stealing all the aid. And it's like, well, like this is doublespeak. You can only have one. Of course, the truth is that Israel is not letting in any aid. Um, and that's always been the policy. That now they're weaponizing aid. They're giving out rice and flour, but there's no access to water. So what are you supposed to do with raw rice and no water? Um, so the starvation has become undeniable. But even with the Zionist Federation of Australia and some other Israel lobby groups here, they now acknowledge the famine, but they're still absolving Israel of any responsibility. They might acknowledge that Israel should do better, but not at best they'll say it should do better, but they won't say it's done the wrong thing.
Or criticize the
Um,
UN as well, right? Or they'll add some other reason or whataboutism as to why this is an issue.
mm. But it is pretty significant because the Israeli government itself is still doubling down on this argument that there's no famine. So there is a pretty significant rift here happening
Mm.
where the Australian lobby groups and lobby groups around the world are starting to break away, and they're starting to find the balls to have their own talking points that are at odds with the Israeli government. Even then, however, there's no direct criticism. That's what's really important. There's no direct criticism of Israeli government policy. There's just this reinterpretation after the fact of, this is what they really mean. This is what they're really doing, and they're still doing the right thing, they'll say. So
It's like a block, like an update of a block there. Like, so could this be reflecting? You say a lot of the dirty laundry isn't aired, but could these statements reflect the wider sentiment of the Australian Jewish community? Could there be a revulsion to the hunger and the starvation, or are we talking about damage control within the momentum that's going on against the genocide at the moment?
yeah, I mean, if a rift like this is happening and it's in the public eye with statements, and it wasn't just the Zionist Federation of Australia, it was groups across the board, even the furthest right wing one here in Australia, the Australian Jewish Association has admitted that there's famine. And I mean, if that rift, that breakaway from Israeli stated policy and stated talking points that there is no famine there, if that's happening in the public eye, there is a lot more happening behind closed doors. There would be people arguing, yelling at the team meetings with their bosses and managers and so on. There would be. But the bottom line is that the most they could muster in the public eye is a mealy mouthed statement that says, yes, there's famine, it's really terrible, our hearts bleed for the Palestinian kids, and it's all Hamas's fault. So you got to take it for what it is, but it certainly paints a pretty big picture. I mean, often we
It
have it seen.
contrasts with the stark explanation that you said about these little statelets and the impossibility of the two-state solution, and this kind of like two-gear thing where, yeah, it's like, oh, we're acknowledging the starvation of the Palestinian people, but behind the surface, behind the blinkers, we're seeing that potentially this is an inevitable process of what the status quo we've been imposing the
Mm,
whole time, right?
exactly. I mean, a couple of days after October 7, Israel's Ministry of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said, and this is submitted to the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, where he's got charges of war crimes. He said, um, there'll be no gas, food, water, electricity, and so on into Gaza. We are fighting human animals and we will treat them accordingly. I mean, it has been Israel's policy since day one to have a medieval siege, to spread disease through Gaza, to weaponize aid, to stop any sort of aid. And Israel controls all of the borders and the skies and the seas over Gaza. And legally, at least, not a single pin goes in or out of Gaza without Israeli approval. That also includes the Egyptian side of the border. Um, and that was even before October 7. There's nothing that gets in or out. So when Israel says we're not letting in any food or water, then nothing goes in. They've had these policies. I mean, between March and May for 3 months, um, there was the policy of not a single pin goes in or out of Gaza. So it's no surprise that now there's famine, and it's a man-made famine. I mean, this isn't an accident. This is because Israel created this. It was part of the plan. I mean, it's easier to starve people than to massacre them one by one.
And it was carried out
Um,
with the advocacy and support of these Australian-based Zionist entities, right? I mean, up to a point, all the way through. I mean, from the UNRWA fund cutting by Penny Wong in February last year, this pressure has been applied by these Zionist lobby groups that has, essentially led to where we are today.
exactly. I mean, Penny Wong has now said in Parliament that, or the Senate rather, that it's pretty clear during March when Israel had that policy of not a single pin goes in inside Gaza. that that was a breach of international law. But, it's August now. What happened during March? Well, even during October 2023, as I've mentioned before, Yoav Gallant said, no food, gas, water, or electricity going into Gaza. We're fighting human animals. We treat them accordingly. I mean, this has always been Israeli policy.
And
So,
Keir Starmer, said what he was thinking, and potentially the same thing was going on in Canberra as well.
yeah, I mean, why didn't she mention Penny Wong? These were your thoughts in March, and you still haven't committed to any involvement with the International Court of Justice's case, with upholding the arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court, which include using starvation as a weapon of war. They're still sitting on the fence here. Um, it's just really bizarre. I mean, a couple months ago, there was this Israeli far right influencer and political commentator, this guy Hillel Fuld, who's coming here to do kind of a press tour, fundraising tour for different Zionist charities. And there were some activists from the Palestinian side who organized to write letters to the Department of Home Affairs to lobby to have his visa revoked. And they pointed specifically to his denial of what's called the Flower Massacre in um, last year, 2024, would have been around February, I believe.
Horrendous
And
scenes.
something like now there's, Flower Massacre Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, and so on. But they said that Hillel Fuld denied documented atrocities in Gaza. Now, atrocities is a legal term specifically used to refer to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide. Now, the Department of Home Affairs wrote a decision letter to Hillel Fuld to say, we're revoking your visa to visit Australia because you are denying documented atrocities by Israel. But this was actually the first time that Australia had acknowledged documented atrocities by Israel. So they took a break from denying it themselves to revoke another visa from some Israeli to accuse him of denying it when they themselves have never publicly stated their acknowledgement. It's just a really bizarre thing. Um, and they're really just yet to take any concrete action. I mean, on the same day Penny Wong was acknowledging Israel broke the law in March, broke international law. Senator David Shoebridge was questioning her about sending F-35 parts directly to Israel. And she said, well, these are non-lethal parts of a fighter jet. Right. So, we're not trading lethal arms to Israel, apparently. Just lethal parts, just, parts of a fighter jet. It beggars belief.
The non-lethal parts of a fighter jet could be one of the highlights of Penny Wong's career right there. It was absolutely mind melting to see her, sort of square off the parliament like that as well, with all that was going on there with One Nation, kind of doing what it did, following by Marine Faruqi. Um, it's there's a frustrating aspect to this. Like, it's a really top heavy scenario right now, where you have this kind of like incredibly captured political class that's doing everything it can to protect these powerful Zionist interests in the country. And I think this can be exemplified a lot in this pipeline that we're kind of speaking to. And you look at the, say, returning IDF soldiers. I think that's a really good example of how, this status quo is being maintained, the normalcy to be allowing this sort of thing to happen. And I suppose I wanted to speak about your article about the universities, and how, essentially student union groups and these Zionist entities were hosting IDF members to do chats at universities. And I was just wondering if you could shed a bit of light on that.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of thing happens really often in Jewish day schools, actually. But the thing is, Andrew Breitbart, the American publisher, founder of BuyBar.com. He's got a famous quote, which actually, forgive me for quoting someone on the far right, hits the nail on the head. Society is downstream from politics, or culture is downstream from politics. And the universities, you'd always say, are the center of that. If you win the universities, you win the future of the political debate. You win the center of it. Um, I mean, when I was um, president of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students at UNSW, we were able to get a direct line onto the Chancellor and Deputy Vice Chancellor, which is actually Gillian Segal at the time, um, and David Gonski. And there was a stated policy written down. You can read about this in Honiswa, the UCIT student paper, published an article about this, that there was a written policy in the Jewish Student Union of reporting incidents that as anti-Semitic, even if the victim was not really uh, believing that it was anti-Semitic. There was you had to report it as a matter of policy if you were a member of the union. I shouldn't say you had to. It was the policy of the group that you would report it as anti-Semitic and you would let them handle it for you. And that was their advice to their members. And I mean, back in late March, there was a couple different soldiers and fundraisers and veterans who came around to many different unis with a group called Stand With Us Australia, and Israel is Israel-IS, and they were, they were there to whitewash Israel's crimes. What's really ironic is their location would have been unknown to us as journalists when we were writing it, but they kept it hidden, and it moved a few times. UCID management tried to lie to people that it was not going ahead, but people didn't really believe them. So instead, they protested outside the Chancellor's office. And what do you know? You get a whole lot of Zionists walking into an event at the Chancellor's office.
Who's also
And
sympathetic
so
to the cause, right?
it's also sympathetic to the cause. And so, well, that's where the event had been moved to that day. Um, I mean, this is the way that they cover this particular event was designed. You put on these high tech AI glasses, and you get this kind of like AI video you can interact with, where you're talking to a survivor of October 7, and walking through the ruins of the towns nearby, and um, things like that. Um,
And this
but
is all
again,
this is all coming at a time where there's like a crackdown on pro-Palestinian activity at universities too, right?
exactly, exactly. I mean, but it's just really bizarre that this is going ahead. I mean, the funniest thing we found when going through this group is um, that Israel is, I mean, they're partnered with um, the IDF and partnered with the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, which, by the way, granted something like $150 million to influencers, to give them a little bit of a boost. And we found this massive network of different groups that would teach you how to do social media, teach you how to be personable in front of an audience, how to grow from 5K followers to 10K followers, and all of these things. They would even disseminate articles or videos of the day. If you post this, it'll be trending. And um, I would strongly suspect that there's a lot of access to bots as well to get followers. um, and there was this group, um, Israel had just the most bizarre website. This is a quote. Their objective is to, quote, connect with people before they connect with ideas. Strip it of any
Get them
ideology.
right at the coalface. You're not going in there. Yep.
Yeah. Now, particularly, they achieve this objective through cutting edge technologies like VR and AI. Yeah. Connect with people before ideas through VR and AI. Yeah, ChatGPT, a real emotional connection there. These guys were touring UCID, doing all the different stops at different major universities around Australia. Now they have 18 staff on their website with character profiles and different headshots. All of them look like, frankly, perhaps they are real people. They're boring enough to be AI generated in their headshots, but they have an IDF coordinator as one of their staff. They have 2 employees serving as, quote unquote, head of Influencer Academy.
Influencer Academy. What a role.
Yeah. It's just bizarre. Do you imagine
Well, the
you
Hasbara
meet some
budget's big enough for this kind of fluff to be floating around in these positions, isn't it? So yeah, it's incredible. It is bizarre.
Could you
Um,
imagine someone asks you what you do for work at a pub? You tell them, oh, I work as head of Influencer Academy with a group that's partnered with the Foreign Army. Head of Influencer Academy. Good Lord.
and like this is going hand in hand with the appearance from actual IDF soldiers that may or may not have been involved in war crimes in Gaza. Um, and like this is the thing that I suppose baffles a lot of people here. The media was covering quite a bit. ISIS families and ISIS fighters that Australian-based extremists that were running over to Syria and in these sort of soldiers of fortune that were getting involved in God knows what in these criminal activities in Syria. Uh, but we haven't heard so much from the press about these returning soldiers from these, like incredibly brutal conflict zones, in Gaza. So, for starters, what's the current situation for returning Australian Israelis? And are there any barriers to their return, or is it just kind of like this open conduit for them to come home?
Yeah, well, I mean, I reported on this for Michael West a few times, but the most recent story was covering a freedom of information that was filed to get access into any legal advice um, within the Attorney General Department on returning IDF soldiers who are Australian or living in Australia, coming from Israel. Um, and the only thing that we really got was that yes, they had received letters from um, law firms, the Australian Centre of International Justice, um, advising them that they're obligated under Australian law and international humanitarian law, under the Rome Statute and under the Criminal Code Act of the Commonwealth, to investigate for war crimes. That there is an obligation under our own law. The only thing we got was these are the talking points issued to Attorney General at the time, Mark Dreyfus, which do not mention Israel, which do not mention war crimes, which do not mention IDF. Talking points about an investigation into war crimes, which do not mention war crimes or the culprit. It's essentially, mate, talk about the weather and the traffic instead. So there's no evidence of any actual investigations into any war crimes conducted by Israelis. The estimates are that there's roughly 1,000 Australian IDF soldiers. And, there are groups which, how do I say this? They have Australian subsidiaries and Australian wings. And in Israel, the leaders of these organizations, Hatzafim and Garin Sabah, there is a Garinsabar unit within IDF's recruitment unit. It's as clear as day, as you can say. Um, Now, they describe themselves as, yeah, we're recruiters for an army. Now, I'm not alleging that that happens here in Australia. They did not respond to my request for comment about whether they are recruiting, which is a crime under Australian law. So I'm not alleging that, but they provide, they are subsidiaries of these Israeli groups. There's Garinsabar in Australia, and they provide um, support packages, you could say, to people who have already enlisted in the IDF, who are IDF recruits
Mm.
um, from Australia, and they will provide free accommodation, free plane flights, Hebrew language courses, um, and everything. And the preparation for these Garin Sabah programs doesn't begin when you touch down in Israel. It begins here in Australia, and they say so themselves. The preparation process begins here. And I think there's some serious questions about, well, are these guys already IDF recruits? Have they already enlisted before they come across these programs? Or are they incentivized or more likely to join because they come into contact with Garin Sabah programs first and then they sign up to IDF? Um, and I mean, these programs are very, very well networked and connected. So,
With no checks and balances on, over 1,000 Australians that could be over there, committing war crimes. And you say that they could be eligible to be charged here, under the
mm,
Rome Statute. So with the submissions of, the reams of evidence and hours of video that are being submitted to, South Africa, to the ICJ via South Africa, is there a
mm.
chance that these people could be caught on some of these, some of this evidence, and that there could be a process to charge these people in Australia?
Not through the International Criminal Court. I mean, that's incredibly unlikely because the International Criminal Court is the last resort for when a country's judicial system has essentially failed or is not acting in any sort of way remotely fairly. Um, so it stepped in, of course, with Israel because, I mean, it's really bolstered by the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion in July last year that Israel's an apartheid state with a two-tiered legal system. So, it follows, therefore, that its legal system is not fairly investigating war crimes. Um, but with Australia, I mean, you'd have to see the courts really um, be 10 notches worse than they are now. The obligation, first and foremost, is on the government to investigate. Unfortunately, that is always signed off. When it comes to war crimes, it's signed off personally by the Attorney General. Um, so, the police can't lay these charges. Um, as far as we know, there is not a single investigation so far. There was a big story several months ago about some Israelis were being screened when they were coming into Australia and when they were applying for their visas. They were asked, have you participated in any war crimes? Um, and I've heard some conflicting reports about this. I haven't been able to get down to the bottom of it. That sometimes, Israelis were specifically targeted with these questions, or that their answers were dealt with greater scrutiny. And I've also heard that this is quite standard from anyone applying for a visa that is coming from a country in a war zone. I'm not really sure. So,
Are there little like increments, like say, could this be in line with Hillel Fuld and the sanctions on Ben Gvir and Smotrich, just sort of like the cherry picking where they can apply it without getting into too much trouble? Or, is it opportunism, or is it the slight, as you said, the slight the sign of balls growing?
I think, I mean, fundamentally, my approach was I'm not going to name all the different IDF soldiers I know. Um, Opens up way too much to defamation risks. And again, in some ways, they're kind of growing up in similar environments to me. And um, I decided to go after the recruiters and the people running in Australia the supplementary support package programs, let's say. Um, you could think of it as like in the wire. Good police, they don't go after the rip and runs on the drug dealers in the corner. You go for the kingpins. You go for the guys who are the big time suppliers. So um, now to think that I mean, I didn't get a response of any sort of value from any government agency about any of these, and the freedom of information shows that they just um, dodged any calls. I mean, this is a very well sourced legal letter by an internationally respected firm, the Australian Centre of International Justice, saying you have an obligation under our law and international law to investigate. And instead, what you get is talking points that don't even mention investigations, don't even mention war crimes, don't even mention. I mean, if you look at what happened with Ukraine, there was recruitment of Australians happening there too. Um, and what you had was the Ukrainian ambassador in Australia saying, do not go, do not enlist. Can you imagine the Israeli ambassador saying such a thing? Never in a million years. Or the pro-Israel lobby leaders? No, never in a million years. It's glorified in so many ways. I mean, these guys do speaking tours at Jewish day schools and universities, um, and speak to kids, you know, for special presentations at synagogues. Um, so, you know, instead, we had even the Liberal government at the time, people like Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg saying, there are war crimes happening in Ukraine and Russia. And if you go, you will be opening yourself up to those investigations. And they said so explicitly. And Ukraine, frankly, is our ally as Australians. So, but they didn't mince their words. With Israel, there's no such thing. I mean, the closest thing we get is in the talking points, Dreyfus and etc. and the Labour cabinet saying we advise Australians to um, obey international law in all situations, no matter where they go abroad. There's no mention of Israel potentially breaking those laws. It's ridiculous.
And that kind of glorified transfer, that pipeline from diaspora around the world that can return to Israel and serve in the army. It's incredible how the governments of those people that live in those countries have the same blinkers on that we were talking about before, compared to other scenarios, as you said with Ukraine, as we said with jihadi fighters. So Albanese, Penny Wong, Richard Marles, all these sort of key figures in the Labor Party, including Dreyfus, who's no longer with us, reflect the same kind of core approach to Israel, to these Zionist influence groups as their predecessors did in the coalition. Uh, and, many of these scenarios with these soldiers that are allowed to return home without any, real vetting, that have been, in some of the worst live conflict zones, that we've ever seen. There's one thing that sort of overhangs over this, and that is the, decades long incremental buildup of influence and power of these Zionist groups, and the way that they've managed to assert control over our national narratives. So can you provide a little bit of like information on how, these groups go use their resources to, essentially bend the truth, to influence governments, to work counter to like now the national interest, essentially, after you see what happened on the, Harbour Bridge today. These groups are still pushing our political class, our media, to sort of, parrot these narratives on behalf of Netanyahu's Israel. So, how do they exert this control and how has it built up over the years?
I mean, it's a good question. It's easy to forget actually just how deep these ties run historically. I mean, Australia was considered as the location for a Jewish state before Israel was founded. There was the Kimberley Plan in, I believe it was Western Australia or Northern Territory, and then there was also Tasmania considered. Um, and the Communist Party of Australia was actually the one that heavily lobbied for Israel to be recognized by Australia in the UN, and was the Labour Party in power at the time. And they listened to the Communist Party's lobbying efforts. It's funny how things turn around. So we've always had really strong ties, just like we did with South Africa during its apartheid days. Settler colony states, apartheid states built on genocide and ethnic cleansing and this terra nullius idea, they stick together. There is a unique bond between them. Um, and, um, you know, Mark Liebler, there are stories you can find of him. It's even in his biography called Power Broker. He's got free access behind, the top level security areas of Parliament House. He can walk through any damn door he pleases. And there's no need to knock. You just walk through the door and say, "Mate, I got to talk to you because I've heard that you are, going to vote this way or that way on a motion about Israel." And um, with with a lot of the methods of the Israel lobby, I mean, they are changing. The vast majority of them historically um, would always do things quietly, discreetly, bully someone over a phone call so that they bully someone else, so that they bully someone else, so that someone else steps back in line and knows their place. Um, if you find an event which is supportive of Palestine being hosted at some venue, give them a call and bully the old lady working as a receptionist until she cries and cancels the event, right? Um, and send nasty emails and sign off and say, if you tell anyone, you're going to face legal threats. And these methods are very, very effective. I mean, you can find Mark Liebler talking quite candidly about these methods in an article. It was published in Pearls and Irritations, a transcript of his speech at a pro-Israel lobby event. And then you get the Australian Jewish Association. Their methods are unusual by Australian standards. I mean, they came up in 2017, so you can think of them as kind of like Trump in the Republican presidential primaries. They kind of just come up and say, yeah, we're far right. Yeah, we're the only guys who oppose a two-state solution. We actually represent what Israelis want and think. And we're just going to walk up on here and piss on the stage and put two fingers up, and you're not going to do a damn thing about it because the mainstream lobby groups still don't refuse to criticize Israel. And they twist what Israeli government says to say, well, they still support a two-state solution, but it's just not the right time. And the Australian Jewish Association just says, well, no, they don't. Like, what are you going to do?
And we can tell by
And
their Twitter presence, which is insane, that
that's it.
yes,
They
that they're
they go
pretty happy
loud,
about
they
that.
piss on stage, put two fingers up,
Yeah.
and will bully someone on social media to their massive audience and go loud and go abrasive. And that's pretty unusual. We have seen these groups become more, how do I say this, cooperative with each other. When before you could say that there were two warring factions that, I mean, they would do their war behind the scenes, not really airing dirty laundry too often. Maybe every 6 months or so, there'd be an article where they're taking pot shots at each other in the Daily Mail or whatever. But it was relatively rare. Um, and Now they're starting to really work closely together on groups that are associated with advance or following advances political strategies. Groups like Better Australia, Minority Impact Coalition, Queensland Jewish Collective. Um, the quote unquote the establishment of the Israel lobby was working hand in glove with the Australian Jewish Association
Mm.
to use this, you would say, framework campaign infrastructure that Advance has developed to create these fake grassroots campaign during the federal election to get the Greens out, to get the Teals and Independents out, and for the most part for the benefit of the Liberals and to the detriment of the Labor. But I mean, even there were Labor rats in the ranks who were working on these. Um, and this was something really new because these were warring factions that hated each other's guts behind the scenes. Um, Again, though, when you have the most fascist government in Israeli history and it continuously becomes more fascist, that establishment of the lobby is in lockstep. They become more fascist.
Which is
And the
what we've
AJA is
seen.
winning that debate. They've got to come on side with what the AJA is doing.
Yeah, and as they lurch further to the right, to prop this thing up, and we spoke about this before, the ability for these groups to be able to do what their purpose is to do, which is to agitate and to promote Zionist interests within whatever country they're in this case, Australia. Um, we're seeing this now with and we mentioned that the Zionist Federation of Australia sort of split with Tel Aviv making that statement about the starvation and hunger and other groups, as you mentioned. But it's a little bit late. We have seen the biggest protest I've probably seen since the Iraq War today on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and the whole world, driven by the pictures of these starving children and this forced starvation, is really tipping, and you can feel the momentum kind of slowing up against these groups. Um, it's a strange thing because you mentioned that deep rooted kind of influence that goes back quite a fair bit with these groups, and I wonder these groups themselves have built up and called in all their favors over, 5, 6, 7 decades since the formation of Israel to, pressure government to support Israel's actions in Gaza, to pressure, censorship in the media, to sort of, hobble debate, national debate, to, enrage in universities with these kind of decrees and have put pressure on chancellors and things like that to get things done within Israel's remit. So we're seeing this house of cards sort of fall, and my main question out of all of this ramble is: are these groups ultimately destined to fail in the long run? Because they are propping up something that's unconscionable. It is within the interest of a very, very small group, conducting a very sharp end, a very extreme end of something that they've been trying to preserve for a long time. So, could there be an end to the effectiveness of these groups?
Yeah, well, they're hitched to a horse that is dying. I mean, a society that conducts a genocide is not one that is socially cohesive to itself. When you have a society full of conscripted war criminal soldiers, you have a society of executioners. It's like you have someone who says, "Well, um, oh, what's your day job?" Well, my day job is I go to the local prison and I do the lethal injections. I mean, there's a whole society of these people in Israel, and they are mentally damaged. They're not emotionally healthy people. And even if the Palestinians were completely killed off today, that is not a society that can continue to work and in a cohesive manner with itself. I mean, if you think back really to World War II, there's not many of these societies that have done a genocide which have continued as the state was before. So the Israel lobby is hitched to that dying horse, and they will die when that horse dies. But at the same time, I mean, the famine is just undeniable. You think about the fact that there's no more plausible deniability, there's no margin of error here, because, you know, when Israel levels every mosque, every school, every university, hospital in Gaza, um, it takes some time to disprove their narrative when they say, well, you know, Hamas was using that hospital as a terrorist base. Um, you could at least argue that there's a margin of error there, that there's a tiny, slim percentage of believability to Israel's spin on that incident. But the bottom line is, Israel has passed bills through their parliament about using aid as a weapon of war, of taking out the UN as an independent um, vehicle to deliver that aid, to weaponize the aid as a way of undermining Hamas. To there has been policies, bills, legislation passing the Knesset about vetting who gets the aid on the basis of whether their cousin or second cousin or whatever is a member of Hamas, or which political groups they're involved in. Um, and there is no such policy passing the Israeli parliament about, you know, it is now official policy to flatten every hospital in Gaza. I mean, that is an order that is coming from the commanders of the IDF, but it's not. There's something different when it's written down in Parliament and passed by a majority. There is no more deniability here. And when Israel is charged with exactly these crimes by the International Criminal Court, and when the Court of Justice as well is saying you got to let in more aid over and over and over again, there's nothing left to say. So that narrative is dying. Israel's public image is dying. There, we are at this turning point. Mark my words, this is a historical moment. This is the turning point that everyone who's been paying attention to what's happening has been saying will happen eventually, where the media, the politicians, the masses who are still undecided will have a shift, because you can defend, even if you look silly, when every hospital in Gaza is flattened, but you can't defend this. There is no excuse left.
The
There's no
the
room for bullshit.
the ignorance and the entitlement that sees Israel pushing forward this kind of destruction, this like ethnic cleansing, this kind of transmigration to Egypt, or mass starvation, or whatever the hell they're trying to do in Gaza in 2025 in front of the whole world's eyes. And to think that we could get to this game here where people are just dropping dead from hunger, and that we could sustain this. This sort of brutal medieval siege that you speak about has like stained the minds of humanity, due to its like accessibility, and it has completely wounded the Israeli state, and has set in like dangers to Jews around the world by this like Zionist entity that's kind of like poisoned, Judaism, I suppose. Do you feel that there's some kind of like reform process, some moment of like reconciliation that could happen with Israeli society? Or is this like a kind of like going down with a burning ship scenario where there's really, no option but to just kind of trudge through until you fall over?
I mean, it scares me to think about what it's going to take for Israeli society to realize to come to terms with what they've done and to what it's going to take to get justice for Palestine. I mean, I wish we could say that Palestinians will get their land back and get compensation. It's a pipe dream, frankly. Um, I want peace based on justice. I don't want anyone more to die. I don't want Israelis to die. I don't want Palestinians to die, but there's got to be land back. There's got to be compensation. There's got to be, I mean, any Palestinian who has the papers that this was the house that their grandpa lived in during the Nakba. If they still have the key to that house, that's their house. I don't care if it's been sold 10 times over to one Jew and another Jew and another Jew. You got to have your land back. You got to have the legal justice, war criminals getting prosecuted.
Yeah, we
Um,
can't see that happening when you've got these settler gangs running around, looting and sacking villages all around the place at the moment. And
yeah, yeah,
like I mean, apart from America, Washington cutting the aid or cutting the military, um, the weaponry, the airlifts of weaponry into Israel, short of that or some kind of like blockade, or I was thinking about the EU navies getting together and breaking the
yeah.
blockade and coming in
I mean,
and dropping food into Gaza. I mean, save something like that. Are we looking at like the destruction of 2 point something million people there in Gaza?
I I believe we're looking at. I'm not saying, genocide is what happens when ethnic cleansing is attempted, but the people do not want to go. So if you're going to cleanse the land, you take their lives instead of relocating them. And now there's that land is free for the taking. And the Palestinian people are not leaving. I mean, and I think that Norman Finkelstein really gets this right when he says Israel is a lunatic state. They're no longer behaving in the rationalist or what some theorists call realist sense of the word with states. They've lost it. You know, they were always doing a genocide, but it was slow and incremental. And really, the West Bank was the goal. But when October 7 happened, they were consumed by bloodlust. They were humiliated militarily and they wanted revenge. But they were on track to getting the West Bank and annexing it already before October 7. I would say they effectively had really annexed it. They had full control. They just had to not fuck it up, do it slowly, and the world wouldn't really care. The world cares when 100,000 Palestinians die, and then they say, well, now enough Palestinians have died. Oh, now we've reached starvation. So now we're going to say it's terrible enough that we should recognize the Palestinian state. I mean, you take a look at the discourse between Keir Starmer and Bibi. Keir Starmer says Israel must agree to a ceasefire right now, or else UK will recognize a Palestinian state. Okay, so Palestinians don't deserve a state if
Oh man,
there's no ceasefire.
that whole scenario is just sickening from France and
It's
Britain and us tailing behind. It's
what game is this? I mean,
mm,
Palestinians um, deserve a state regardless of whether there's a ceasefire. No, I mean, it's got nothing to do with the ceasefire. Why are you punishing Israel for failing to create a ceasefire? You know what Bibi Netanyahu said? Well, you know what? If the UK creates a recognizes a Palestinian state, we're going to annex all of the West Bank. We're going to build more settlements.
which is on the cards, right? And like you and I have spoken outside many times about the project of Greater Israel, and I'd love to, potentially speak to you a little bit more about it another time. But
Mm,
like von Clausewitz has this trinity, right? Of war, essentially, and there's three reasons you go to war, which is chance. Like an opportunity, right? A reason, so there's a reason behind it, or like enmity, right? Like enmity is like one of the main parts of this triangle, one of the main things that drives a nation towards war. and there's an enmity that against the Palestinian people that's unreasonable. And it's pushing for a place that, regardless of like a Levantine gas basin off the coast, it doesn't seem like a big enough objective, for the cost. And we're talking about a whole like generation of Israeli youth that are like struggling from PTSD. We're talking about the shutdown of the whole Israeli economy. Like, there's no kind of reason or rationale for that to be the case right now. I mean, do you agree on that? Like, are there any voices of reason within Israel that are starting to pipe these lines like in the military, for example, they might be going, hey, we can't sustain this anymore, in the treasury.
They're shut down. They're silenced. They become persona non grata. They do exist. They, of course, don't go anywhere near as far as they should. But I mean, you have a former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, saying that Israel is committing war crimes and apartheid. You have the leader of the largest Israeli Jewish left-wing party, Yair Golan, saying that Israel, the IDF kills babies as a hobby and that they're committing war crimes. You have the IDF Israel's military advocate general uh, writing to Bibi Netanyahu and advising him to investigate IDF massacres at aid sites. Um, you have the former IDF chief of staff and defense minister for Bibi, Moshe Ya'alon, saying that Israel's committing ethnic cleansing. You know what Bibi Netanyahu responded to when these claims were made? For the most part, all of them, but in particular with the IDF, the Israel's military advocate general, he said, "You are peddling anti-Semitic blood libel." I mean, how bizarre is this?
That the voices of
How bizarre
reason
is this?
are just like snuffed out, like,
Exactly, and wasn't acted upon. And if you say the exact same things here in Australia, Gillian Segal or some guy at Sky News or something will say that is anti-Semitic. It's like, hey, you have the Israeli Prime Minister, the ex-Prime Minister saying this. You have
the top
ex-IDF chiefs
top
of staff.
humanitarian groups. You got, it's incredible. You got Haaretz writing articles and doing features that the broadsheets in Australia could only dream of. Once again, reflecting horribly on these entities in Australia. So, looking forward over, as you said, mark my words, this is a shift, and I totally agree with you. You can kind of feel it in the space, and there's a lot of normies talking about Palestine right now, which is something that wasn't there 2 years ago. So, looking ahead, what do you think are the biggest challenges for these groups? And their goal and their message, and also, looking in the light of Gillian Siegel's report, which was very poorly received, and kind of the government has done its best to sort of tuck it away and maybe leave it to the side. So, how do you think that
Hmm.
this is kind of going to play out in the future?
For the Palestinians, their future is that they know now that they can only get justice when they pay in blood. It took 100,000 plus, probably many more of them to die, um, to get Western states even considering to recognize a Palestinian state, to get the world speaking about it. And if there was just a slow genocide where we were taking home by home by home by home in the West Bank, no one would have cared, would have been business as usual, and Israel would have gotten away with it. But they're not acting rationally anymore.
Mm.
Israelis and Jews around the world, need to understand that actually this anti-Zionist Jewish slogan of "not in my name," not worth piss. This is being done in the Jewish name. It's embarrassing that it's shameful that so many Jews support this. Um, Not as much actually as the Israel lobby says. They inflate those numbers, but the numbers are still shameful. And kind of like Germany did during the Cold War, you had to have a lot of guys look in the mirror for hours and get lost in, wow, did I really become a Nazi war criminal? Did I really support the Holocaust? And now know millions of Jews died, and the Roma people, and gay people, black people, disabled people. All these guys died in the gas chambers, and I supported this. And now to look in the mirror and think, wow, am I a terrible person? Did I support the murder of millions? And you gotta reckon with yourself as on a really deep level, not just even as an individual, but as an entire people. This is being done in the Jewish name. With Gillian Siegel, I mean, again, hitched to a dying horse, and she will die with that horse. And the problem with her is that she barked up the wrong tree, because the media and the political class will tag along when you're targeting the activists and the uni students, and maybe the local business that puts a Free Palestine sticker on its front window. Sure. But then when you start saying, well, okay, I, Gillian Siegel, have published a report. I'm advising the government on what the national broadcaster, ABC and SBS, are allowed to say, what the approved political narratives are, what unis are allowed to say and teach. Otherwise, they get funding withdrawn, um,
The
based on her
entitlement,
advice.
the comprehensive entitlement of this woman, like her advice, right? And
And
like
now you've made an
hammering it
enemy.
onto onto the pillars of our society. And yeah, people like your nana are starting to talk about it now, based on what
Well,
what's been seen. So it's shifted the perception of Australia onto this genocide. And the people that were lagging behind now are weighing every day to the side of stop the killing of children. So yeah,
but
they,
the ABC and the unis, ABC, SBS, and the unis, they were along for the ride until she published that report and said, well, I'm going to advise the government on when to withdraw funding, because there are approved political narratives which I want you to peddle. And if you don't, your money's going to be taken away. And that's the point. She made an enemy. And that's when they abandoned ship.
So could we say potentially all the favors, of which there were many, that were built up over that sedimentary amount of influence and slowly building that power space? Could we say that this could be the end of this incredibly remarkable and complex period of like disproportionate Zionist control over Australian daily life and politics?
I think we're starting to see the end, yeah, of its influence here. But in terms of the broader narrative, the broader saga of this genocide, um, who knows? We can't predict the future. Perhaps we're at the end of the beginning. Um, we are past the point where Israel and its public image is redeemable. But Israel uh, has not self-imploded as a culture, as a society, as a state just yet. I mean, even I analogized it before to, Germany during the Cold War. You had to have all the vets, the people from the Nazi era, staring in a mirror and reckoning with themselves.
In
People
Rwanda, in
forget.
East Timor, in Cambodia,
Yeah,
these people that have had to deal and
but
reckon with the past. Yeah,
you still get Nazis today. And in 1980, 1970, you still had Germans who said, well, yeah, I was alive then, and Hitler was a great guy. Still believed in the Nazi dream. So, it didn't, Nazi ideology did not die in 1945. You still had these, few people roaming the streets in Germany who were hanging on to that ideology, hanging on to the glory days. Um, so it's difficult to predict when this will end. I would say its influence over Australia, that is over. We are at that tipping point. In Israel, in Palestine, we're going to have to wait and see. I think we're a long way away from justice.
Yakov, I really appreciate you coming in tonight. You've been a wealth of information, and yeah, you're exploring some things that, including myself, many people don't quite have a grasp and understanding of. You know, the nature of this Zionist influence in Australia. So, thank you very much for coming, mate. And yeah, hopefully we could get you on again soon to talk about some, many aspects that are in your wheelhouse.
All right, mate. I appreciate it.
Thanks, matey. Catch ya.
Thanks for having me. Bye.